You won't believe what happened next. On a brisk morning, James Carter sat silently in his worn armchair, watching the world move on without him. From his modest home in Birmingham, Alabama, the 82-year-old gazed through the window as children laughed on their way to school, joggers paced by, and delivery trucks rumbled down the street. The world seemed so full of life. Yet here he was, alone, surrounded by the echoes of a life well-lived and the photographs of a family that seemed to have grown distant. James ran his hand over the armrest, his fingers brushing against the aged wood smoothed by years of use. "Maybe it's time," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. This wasn't how life was supposed to be, was it? He had given everything to his daughter, Naomi, his energy, his love, and all the wisdom he could muster as a single father after losing his wife, Evelyn, years ago. Yet now, he felt like a relic of the past, a shadow in her busy world. Naomi was his pride and joy, the woman he had raised to become a strong, independent attorney, fighting for justice and making a name for herself in Atlanta. But James couldn't ignore the creeping guilt that came with occupying her guest bedroom for the past 3 years. Naomi's frequent absences only heightened his loneliness. "Daddy, I'm home." Naomi's voice rang out from the front door. James straightened in his chair, startled. His daughter's unexpected arrival at this hour was unusual. She stepped inside, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her sharp navy suit as polished as ever. Her bright smile quickly faded when she noticed her father's weary eyes. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" Naomi asked, setting her bag down on the kitchen counter. James hesitated, then sighed. "Naomi, we need to talk." She arched a brow, crossing her arms. "That sounds serious." "It is," James replied. "I've been thinking maybe it's time for me to go to a nursing home. I don't want to be a burden on you anymore." Her face fell, replaced by a look of confusion and pain. "A burden? Daddy, you're not a burden." He gave her a weak smile. "I know you mean well, but I see how hard you work. You don't need to worry about an old man slowing you down." Naomi took a step closer, kneeling beside him. "Daddy, you've never slowed me down. You've always been my anchor. We're not talking about this right now. Let's get some rest tonight, okay?" James nodded, but the unease lingered. That night, as he lay in bed, his thoughts were plagued by memories of Evelyn and the dreams they had once shared. He had built a life of hard work, integrity, and sacrifice, but now he questioned what it all amounted to. 2 days later, Naomi made an unexpected announcement. "Pack your bags, Daddy," she said with a mysterious grin. James blinked, confused. "What's going on?" "We're going on a little trip this weekend. Trust me, you'll want to see this." Her tone was cheerful, but James's stomach churned with apprehension. Could this be the beginning of his move to a nursing home? Was she sparing him the details to soften the blow? "Where are we going?" he asked cautiously. "You'll see," Naomi replied, giving him a wink. The next morning, Naomi loaded their bags into the car and helped James settle into the passenger seat. As the car pulled away from the house, James glanced back at the only place he had called home in years. "Where are you watching from?" Naomi suddenly asked, smiling as she adjusted the rearview mirror. "Have you ever been in a situation like this? What would you do if someone you loved thought you didn't care about them? Tell me in the comment line below. And if you're enjoying this, don't forget to like and share. This story's just getting started." James frowned. "What are you talking about, Naomi?" "Oh, nothing," she said with a chuckle, brushing off his confusion. As the car merged onto the highway, James gazed out the window, wondering where this road would lead. Would it take him to the solitude he feared, or would there be something waiting for him that he couldn't yet imagine? James watched the scenery blur past the window as Naomi drove, her hands steady on the wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by towering trees that seemed to guard the secrets of their destination. "Naomi," James said, his voice breaking the silence, "are you ever going to tell me where we're going?" Her eyes flicked toward him, a mischievous glint in her gaze. "Patience, Daddy. You'll find out soon enough." He huffed, folding his arms. "You know I don't like surprises. I'd rather know what to expect." "Trust me," she replied with a smile. "It's worth the wait." The tone of her voice was light, But James couldn't shake the weight in his chest. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Was this her way of softening the blow? Of delivering him to a nursing home without forcing him to dwell on the decision? Hours passed, and the hum of the car became a kind of background lullaby. James found himself dozing off, his thoughts drifting to a memory of Naomi as a little girl. He saw her on her first day of school, clutching his hand tightly, her wide eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. "Daddy, what if nobody likes me?" she had asked. "They'd be fools not to," he had reassured her, his heart swelling with pride. "You're smart, kind, and brave. You've got everything you need to shine." The memory faded as he jolted awake, the car slowing to a stop. They were pulling into a small diner off the highway. "Time for a break," Naomi announced, parking the car. James stretched and stepped out, his stiff joints protesting the movement. Inside, the diner was warm and bustling with the aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon. Naomi found them a booth by the window and handed him a menu. "Order anything you want, Daddy," she said, scanning her own menu. James's eyes skimmed over the options, but his appetite was dimmed by the questions swirling in his mind. "Naomi, why are we taking this trip?" he asked directly. She looked up, her face softening. "I told you, it's a surprise. Can't you just enjoy the ride for now?" He sighed. It's hard to enjoy something when you're not sure what's coming next. Naomi reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Daddy, you've done so much for me over the years. Let me do something for you now, okay? Just trust me." Her sincerity was disarming, and James nodded reluctantly. As they ate, Naomi steered the conversation to lighter topics, reminiscing about family holidays and the mischievous pranks she used to pull as a child. James laughed despite himself, momentarily forgetting his worries. But as they got back on the road, the weight of the unknown crept back in. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. James stared at the horizon, lost in thought. "Naomi," he began hesitantly, "if this is about a nursing home, I'll understand. Really, I will." Naomi shot him a sharp glance. "Daddy, it's not what you think. Can you please stop assuming the worst?" He held his hands up defensively. All right, I'll stop." But deep down, his doubts lingered. After another hour, the car turned onto a winding, unpaved road surrounded by dense forest. James's heart quickened. This didn't look like the entrance to a nursing home, or anything familiar, for that matter. "Naomi, where are we?" he asked, gripping the armrest. "We're almost there," she said cryptically. The trees parted to reveal a sprawling piece of land dotted with small cabins and vibrant gardens. A sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Willow Creek Retreat." James blinked in confusion. "What is this place?" Naomi parked the car and turned to him with a smile. "It's a retreat center for seniors. Not a nursing home, don't worry," she added quickly when she saw his skeptical expression. "It's a place where you can relax, meet new people, and maybe even find a little adventure." James furrowed his brow. "Adventure? At my age? Why not?" Naomi asked, grinning. "You've got more life left in you than you realize." As she helped him out of the car, James took in the serene surroundings. People of various ages were strolling through the gardens, chatting on porches and laughing around a fire pit. The air was filled with a sense of peace and vitality. Naomi turned to him, her expression earnest. "Daddy, you deserve to be somewhere where you're cared for, but also where you can live fully. I thought this might be a good place to start." James felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. Part of him was touched by her thoughtfulness, but another part still wrestled with the idea of leaving behind the home he'd built and the memories it held. "Let's just check it out," Naomi urged gently. "No commitments. If you don't like it, we'll leave. Deal?" James hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Deal." As they walked toward the main lodge, James couldn't help but wonder if this unexpected detour might be exactly what he needed, or if it would turn out to be something else entirely. The wooden doors of the lodge creaked open, and a wave of warm air greeted James and Naomi. Inside, the lobby was cozy, adorned with rustic furniture, a crackling fireplace, and walls lined with photographs of smiling faces. A cheerful woman in her late 50s stepped forward, her auburn hair pulled into a neat bun. "Welcome to Willow Creek Retreat," she exclaimed. "You must be James. And you're Naomi, of course." James blinked in surprise. "You know our names already?" Naomi gave a sheepish grin. "I might have called ahead, just to make sure everything was ready." James's eyebrows shot up, suspicion flaring anew. "So you planned this whole thing without telling me?" "Daddy," Naomi said patiently, placing a hand on his arm. "Just hear her out. Please." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Evelyn, the retreat coordinator. It's so lovely to finally meet you both. Naomi's told me so much about you." James shook her hand reluctantly, his grip firm. "Is that so?" Evelyn's smile didn't waver. "She mentioned how much you've sacrificed for your family, how active you used to be, and how you love a good game of chess. We have a fantastic chess club here, by the way." James shot Naomi a glance. "You've been talking about me like I'm some kind of exhibit." Naomi chuckled nervously. "Just bragging about you, that's all." Evelyn gestured toward the seating area. "Why don't we sit down for a bit? I can tell you more about what we offer here, and you can ask me any questions you like." James followed begrudgingly, his steps heavy with skepticism. As they settled into the plush armchairs, Evelyn launched into a polished pitch about the retreat's amenities. Gardening workshops, art classes, fitness programs tailored for seniors, and weekly excursions to nearby towns and nature trails. "We're not a nursing home," Evelyn emphasized, her tone light but firm. "We're a community. Our goal is to provide a space where people can thrive, not just exist." James folded his arms, his gaze steady. "And what happens if someone can't thrive? What if they need more care than this place can offer?" Evelyn nodded, her expression empathetic. "That's a fair question. We have a medical team on site for emergencies and regular check-ins. If someone's needs change significantly, we work with their family to find the best solution. But our focus here is on empowering independence." James leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sounds like a sales pitch to me." "Daddy," Naomi hissed, embarrassed. Evelyn only laughed. "I don't blame you for being cautious, James. It's a big change, and it's natural to have doubts. Why don't I show you around? Seeing it might answer your questions better than I can." James hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "All right, lead the way." Evelyn guided them through the lodge, showing off a bustling dining hall, a cozy library, and a sunlit art studio where a group of residents were painting landscapes. Outside, the grounds were even more impressive. Sprawling gardens, a small lake with paddle boats, and walking trails winding through the woods. As they passed a bocce court, a man in a wide-brimmed hat waved enthusiastically. "Hey, Evelyn, new recruits?" "This is James," Evelyn called back. "He's just visiting for now." The man ambled over, extending a hand. "Name's Walter. Been here 2 years now. Best decision I ever made." James shook his hand, studying the man's weathered face and genuine smile. "You like it here?" "Love it," Walter said. "Keeps me busy, keeps me social. And the food's not half bad either." Naomi nudged James playfully. "See? Doesn't sound too terrible, does it?" James gave a noncommittal grunt, though he couldn't deny the place had a certain charm. Still, charm wasn't enough to erase his reservations. After the tour, they returned to the lodge, where Evelyn handed James a folder of information. "Take your time to think it over," she said warmly. "You're welcome to stay the night in one of our guest cabins if you'd like. No pressure, either way." James glanced at Naomi, who looked at him expectantly. With a sigh, he said, "All right, one night." Naomi beamed. "You'll love it, Daddy. I promise." The guest cabin was quaint but comfortable, with a soft bed, a small kitchenette, and a porch overlooking the lake. As James sat on the porch later that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, he found himself conflicted. The retreat was beautiful, and the people seemed kind. But was this what Naomi truly thought he needed? Was this her way of easing him into giving up his independence, or was there something more to her plan? The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Naomi appeared, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. She handed him one and took the seat beside him. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked softly. James sipped his tea, savoring its warmth. Just trying to figure out what you're really up to. Naomi laughed lightly. I told you. It's not a trick, Daddy. I just want you to be happy. That's all. He studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. But all he saw was sincerity and love. As the stars began to fill the sky, James let out a long breath. All right, he said. I'll give this place a chance. But only because you've gone through so much trouble to bring me here. Naomi grinned, her eyes glistening. That's all I needed to hear. James wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the guest cabin, waking James gently. He stretched, listening to the faint hum of life beyond the window. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint sound of laughter floated up from the garden. Despite the serenity, James felt a pang of unease. This place might be beautiful, but it wasn't home. After freshening up, he made his way to the dining hall, where Naomi was already seated at a table, chatting with Evelyn. A plate of fluffy pancakes and fresh fruit sat waiting for him. Good morning, Daddy. Naomi greeted cheerfully. How'd you sleep? James shrugged, sitting down. Not bad. He picked up his fork, hesitating for a moment before digging in. Evelyn smiled. We have a walking tour of the grounds scheduled after breakfast if you're interested, James. Or you're welcome to explore on your own. James gave a non-committal grunt, focusing on his plate. Naomi reached over, squeezing his hand. Just try to enjoy it, okay? Reluctantly, James joined the walking tour, tagging along behind a small group of residents. Evelyn led the way, pointing out various features of the retreat. There was a greenhouse filled with vibrant flowers, a small woodworking shop, and even a music room where someone was softly playing the piano. As they passed the lake, James noticed Walter sitting on a bench, whittling a piece of wood. The older man looked up and waved him over. James hesitated but decided to join him, stepping away from the group. Walter grinned as James approached, motioning for him to sit. Morning, James. Beautiful day, isn't it? James nodded, sitting down. It is. Walter held up the piece of wood he was working on. It was beginning to take the shape of a bird. This keeps my hands busy. Helps me think. James watched him carve, the blade moving deftly over the wood. You seem content here, he said cautiously. Walter chuckled. I am. Took me a while to get here, though. What do you mean? Walter set the carving down, turning to face James. When my kids first brought me here, I hated the idea. Thought they were trying to get rid of me. But over time, I realized they weren't pushing me away. They were giving me a chance to start fresh, to find a new purpose. James frowned. But what about your independence? Doesn't being here feel like giving up? Walter shook his head. Not at all. If anything, I've gained more here than I ever thought possible. Friends, hobbies, peace of mind. But it's not for everyone, James. You have to figure out what you want. James sat in silence, mulling over Walter's words. The idea of finding a new purpose was appealing, but could he really let go of the life he'd built for himself? Later that day, Naomi found him sitting on the porch of the guest cabin, staring out at the lake. She sat beside him, her expression curious. You've been quiet today, she remarked. Just thinking, James replied. About what? He turned to face her, his eyes serious. Why now, Naomi? Why are you so eager to bring me here? You've never mentioned anything like this before. Naomi sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Daddy, I've been watching you struggle for months. You don't go out as much as you used to. You barely see your friends. I don't want you to feel like you're alone. James frowned. I'm not alone. I have you. You do, Naomi said softly. But I can't be there all the time. I wish I could. But with work and everything else. Her voice trailed off, and James saw the guilt in her eyes. I just want you to have a support system, she continued. People who understand what you're going through. A place where you can be happy and active. James studied her, searching for any hidden motives. But all he saw was genuine concern and love. I don't need to stay here, he said firmly. I can manage on my own. Naomi nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I know you can, but maybe you don't have to. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore. That evening, James joined a small group in the library for a chess game. Walter was there, along with a spry woman named Margaret, who turned out to be a formidable opponent. As James moved his knight across the board, Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Bold move," she remarked. James smirked. Sometimes bold is the only way to go. He won the game, much to Margaret's chagrin, and for the first time since arriving, he felt a flicker of enjoyment. But as he returned to his cabin that night, doubt crept back in. Was he really considering staying? Or was he just trying to make Naomi happy? As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought lingered in his mind. What if this place wasn't the end, but a new beginning? The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the dining hall the next morning as James made his way to breakfast. The early risers were already chatting in small groups, their laughter echoing against the high ceilings. James grabbed a plate and found an empty seat near the window, the view of the garden providing a peaceful backdrop. He had barely taken a bite of his toast when a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Mind if I join you, James?" It was Walter, holding a tray laden with eggs and sausage. Without waiting for a reply, he plopped down across the table. "Good to see you here bright and early," Walter said with a grin. James smirked. "Figured I'd give the food another chance." Walter chuckled. "Not bad, right? Though I'd kill for some real bacon every now and then." The two men ate in companionable silence for a while before Walter leaned forward, his tone turning serious. "You know, I saw you at the chess game last night. Pretty impressive moves." James shrugged. "Just a game." "Maybe," Walter said, tapping his fork against his plate. "But you seemed alive. Like you were enjoying yourself." James frowned. "What are you getting at?" Walter leaned back, crossing his arms. "You've got a fire in you, James. Don't let it go out because you're holding on to the past." Before James could respond, Evelyn appeared at their table, her clipboard in hand. "Good morning, gentlemen," she greeted. "James, I wanted to let you know about a painting class happening this afternoon. Thought you might enjoy it." James raised an eyebrow. "Painting? Me?" Evelyn smiled. "You'd be surprised at the hidden talents people discover here." Walter laughed. "Come on, James. What's the harm in trying?" Reluctantly, James agreed. That afternoon, James found himself in the art room, surrounded by canvases, paintbrushes, and a small group of eager participants. The instructor, a petite woman with silver hair named Helen, handed him a blank canvas and a palette of colors. "Just let your instincts guide you," she said encouragingly. James stared at the canvas, unsure where to start. He glanced around the room, noticing the others already immersed in their work. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. "Maybe you don't have to manage on your own." He picked up a brush and hesitantly dipped it into the blue paint, starting with broad strokes. Slowly, an image began to take shape, a serene lake surrounded by towering trees. As he worked, James felt a surprising sense of calm. The act of painting transported him, quieting the doubts and fears that had been plaguing him. "Not bad," Helen commented, peering over his shoulder. "You've got an eye for landscapes." James chuckled. "Beginner's luck, I guess." By the time the class ended, James felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He wasn't ready to call himself an artist, but he had to admit there was something satisfying about creating something from nothing. That evening, Naomi stopped by his cabin, her expression brightening when she saw the painting propped against the wall. "Did you do that?" she asked, her eyes wide. James nodded, slightly embarrassed. "Just something from today's class." "It's beautiful," Naomi said softly, running her fingers along the edge of the canvas. "I didn't know you had it in you." James shrugged, trying to downplay the compliment. "It's no masterpiece." "It doesn't have to be," Naomi replied. She looked at him, her expression tender. "I'm proud of you, Daddy." Her words warmed James in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time since arriving, he began to wonder if there was more to this place than he had given it credit for. Later that night, as James sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Walter joined him once again. "Word is you're an artist now," Walter teased. James chuckled. "Hardly." Walter leaned back, gazing at the stars. "You know, this place isn't about giving up. It's about finding pieces of yourself you didn't know were missing. James didn't respond, but Walter's words lingered. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to discover. Not just about this place, but about himself. As the night deepened, James felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps this journey wasn't just Naomi's plan to care for him. Perhaps it was his opportunity to care for himself. James woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. Maybe this place wasn't so bad after all. He got dressed and headed for breakfast, his steps a little lighter than usual. As he reached the dining hall, Evelyn intercepted him with a familiar warm smile. "James, there's mail for you," she said, holding out a small envelope. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anything. Taking the envelope, he saw Naomi's neat handwriting scrawled across the front. "Thanks," he muttered, tucking it into his pocket. Curiosity gnawed at him throughout breakfast, but he decided to wait until he was back in his cabin to read it. Sitting in his favorite armchair, James carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Naomi, along with a photograph. He unfolded the letter, the smell of her familiar perfume wafting up from the paper. "Dear Daddy, I hope this letter finds you well. I know this isn't what you wanted, and I can't imagine how hard it must have been to leave your home. But I need you to know that I made this decision because I love you, not because I wanted to take anything away from you." James paused, his throat tightening. He glanced at the photograph, a picture of him and Naomi from her college graduation. She was beaming in her cap and gown, and he stood proudly beside her, his arm draped around her shoulders. "You've always been my hero, Daddy. From the moment I was little, you've shown me what strength, love, and resilience look like. But now it's time for you to let someone else carry the weight for a while." He leaned back in the chair, blinking away the sudden moisture in his eyes. "This place is meant to give you a chance to rest and rediscover parts of yourself that you've set aside. Please don't think of it as losing your independence. Think of it as gaining a community, gaining experiences, and maybe even a little bit of joy." James set the letter down, staring at the photograph. The love in Naomi's words wrapped around him like a warm embrace, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of understanding. That afternoon, James walked through the garden, the letter tucked safely in his pocket. He found a quiet bench near the rose bushes and sat down, letting the late autumn sun warm his face. He wasn't alone for long. Evelyn appeared, her ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. James gestured to the seat beside him. Evelyn sat down, her gaze sweeping over the garden. "You've been settling in, haven't you?" "Something like that," James said, his tone noncommittal. She smiled knowingly. "I know it's not easy. Letting go of the life you've built is one of the hardest things anyone can do. But sometimes, it's not about letting go. It's about finding new ways to hold on." James nodded slowly. "Naomi, she sent me a letter today. Said she thought this place might help me find parts of myself I'd forgotten about." Evelyn's smile widened. "Smart woman, your daughter. She sounds a lot like you." James chuckled softly. "She's better than me. Always has been." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the soft rustling of the trees filling the air. "You know," Evelyn said after a moment, "there's a storytelling night happening in the lounge tomorrow. Residents share memories, stories from their lives. It might be something you'd enjoy." James hesitated. "I'm not much of a storyteller." "Everyone has a story worth telling," Evelyn replied. "Think about it." That evening, as James sat in his cabin, he reread Naomi's letter. Her words stirred something deep within him, a longing to connect, to share, to be a part of something again. He picked up the photograph, tracing the edges with his finger. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to reflect on the chapters of his life that had brought him to this point. For the first time since arriving, he felt a small but powerful desire to let others see him, not just as an old man, but as James, a father, a fighter, and a man with stories worth telling. As the moon rose high above the trees, James made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go to storytelling night. The lounge buzzed with quiet anticipation as residents settled into their seats. A warm fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. James hesitated at the doorway, his heart pounding. He clutched Naomi's letter in his pocket like a lifeline. Evelyn noticed him lingering and waved him over with a welcoming smile. "You came," she said, patting the seat next to her. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss is about," James replied, his voice gruff but his steps resolute. The room was a mix of familiar faces and strangers. Some people clutched notebooks or mementos. Others simply sat with their hands folded. James sat down, his hands resting uneasily on his knees. "Good evening, everyone," Evelyn began, standing at the front. "Welcome to Storytelling Night. This is one of my favorite events because it reminds us of the incredible lives we've all led. Tonight, we celebrate those memories. Who would like to begin?" A frail woman with sparkling eyes raised her hand. She introduced herself as Margaret and began to share a tale of her childhood summers spent on her grandparents' farm. Her voice carried the room to another time, painting pictures of fields, laughter, and simpler days. One by one, others shared their stories, some humorous, others poignant. Laughter filled the air, followed by moments of hushed reverence as tales of loss and resilience unfolded. James listened intently, his initial discomfort giving way to a growing admiration for the bravery in the room. These people had lived full, complex lives, and they weren't afraid to bare their souls. Evelyn glanced at James as the room quieted down. "James," she said gently, "would you like to share something?" Every head turned toward him, and for a moment, he wanted to disappear into the floor. But then he felt the letter in his pocket, Naomi's words bolstering his courage. He stood, his legs shaky but determined. I'm not much of a storyteller," he began, his deep voice rumbling through the room. "But my daughter seems to think I've got something worth sharing, so here goes." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My name is James. I was born in the South during a time when the world wasn't kind to men like me. I grew up fast, learned how to work hard, and how to fight even harder to make a life for myself." The room leaned in, captivated by his commanding presence. "I met the love of my life, Lillian, when I was barely out of my teens. She had the sweetest smile and a laugh that could chase away the darkest clouds. We didn't have much, but we built a home, raised a family. She passed 10 years ago, and not a day goes by that I don't miss her." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. James nodded his thanks before continuing. "My daughter Naomi, she's my everything. Smart as a whip, stubborn as her mama. She sent me here, thinking it might help me find some peace. And I'll be honest, I wasn't happy about it." Several people chuckled knowingly. "But tonight, listening to all of you, I think I'm starting to understand. Life doesn't stop just because we're older. There's still so much to share, to learn, to give." James sat down to a wave of applause, his heart pounding but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. As the evening wound down, several residents approached James to thank him for his story. One man, Richard, clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got a way with words, James. Don't let that go to waste." James smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. "Thanks. I'll think about it." Evelyn caught him on his way out. "You were amazing tonight," she said. "See? I told you everyone has a story worth telling." James chuckled. "Guess you were right." He walked back to his cabin under a canopy of stars, the night air crisp and invigorating. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel alone. James realized something powerful. Sharing his story wasn't just for him. It was a bridge, connecting him to others in ways he hadn't imagined. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter worth living. The morning sun filtered softly through the blinds of James's room, casting long shadows on the walls. He stretched, his muscles still sore from the eventful night before. Last night had been a breakthrough of sorts, not just for him but for the others too. The stories they'd shared lingered in his mind, stirring a sense of camaraderie he hadn't expected to find. There was a knock at his door. "Come in," James called, pulling himself from the bed and adjusting his robe. The door creaked open, and to James's surprise, it was Naomi who stepped into the room. His heart skipped a beat, and a wave of emotion washed over him. He hadn't expected to see her today. She'd told him she'd be busy with work, but here she was, standing in the doorway with a warm smile and a bouquet of fresh flowers in her hand. "Dad," Naomi said softly, walking toward him. I hope I didn't interrupt anything. James's voice caught in his throat. He hadn't seen Naomi in months, and the sight of her standing in front of him filled him with an overwhelming mix of pride, love, and confusion. The past few weeks had been challenging, and he hadn't been sure how to feel about her decision to send him here. But now, seeing her here, all of those feelings seemed to melt away. You're here, James said, his words filled with disbelief. Naomi nodded, setting the flowers down on the small table near the window. I wanted to check on you. You've been doing so well, Dad. I thought I'd surprise you. James struggled to find the right words. I didn't expect you to come so soon. Well, I was curious to see how you're really doing, she said, giving him a playful smile. I think you've been holding out on me. You've been telling me everything's fine, but I had to see it for myself. James chuckled, but there was a hint of defensiveness in his voice. I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want to burden you. You could never be a burden to me, Naomi said, her voice softening. I just wanted to make sure you were really adjusting, you know? I've been hearing great things from Evelyn and the staff. James felt his chest tighten at the mention of Evelyn. She had been a steady presence in his life since he'd arrived. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, heard, and appreciated. Something James hadn't realized he needed until now. But there was something else too, a growing sense of connection, something he had been missing for a long time. I've been getting to know the others here, James said slowly. Last night, we had a storytelling session. You wouldn't believe the things people have lived through. I think I'm starting to understand why I'm here. Naomi looked at him, her eyes searching. And how do you feel about it now? James exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. I guess I was wrong. I thought this place would be just a waiting room for the end of my life. But it's more than that. There's still so much to share, to learn, to do. Naomi smiled, her eyes softening with pride. I'm glad to hear that, Dad. I always knew there was more to you than you realized. James felt a surge of emotion at her words. He hadn't known how much he needed to hear that until now. It felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. I've been thinking about something, Naomi said, stepping closer. I know you've had a rough time accepting this whole situation, but maybe there's more I can do to help you feel more at home here. James looked at her, puzzled. What do you mean? Well, Naomi continued, hesitating for a moment. I've been talking to Evelyn and some of the staff here. They're planning a special event next month, a family day, where the residents can invite their loved ones to visit and spend time together. I thought it might be a good opportunity for us to connect again, to share a little more than just phone calls and letters. James's eyes widened. The thought of having Naomi with him, to be a part of this new chapter, filled him with a sense of warmth he hadn't expected. That sounds great, Naomi, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I think it's time we really spent time together, not just as father and daughter, but as people trying to make sense of life. Naomi smiled, her eyes bright with a mix of excitement and relief. I'm looking forward to it, Dad. I think it'll be good for both of us. Before James could respond, there was another knock at the door. Naomi turned toward it, her brow furrowing slightly. Who could that be? She wondered aloud. But before she could open the door, Evelyn appeared, her smile wide and welcoming. I hope I'm not interrupting, Evelyn said, her voice full of cheer. I thought I'd stop by to see how James was doing after last night's storytelling session. It was such a wonderful turnout. She looked at Naomi, then back at James. Oh, and I see we have a visitor. How lovely to see you, Naomi. Naomi smiled, standing up to greet Evelyn. I didn't expect to see you today either, Evelyn, but I'm happy to see you. Evelyn nodded. I heard we had a very special guest last night, someone who's beginning to find their way here, she said, her eyes twinkling knowingly. James chuckled, feeling the warmth of the moment settle around him. I suppose that's true. Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. James, you've been an inspiration to all of us here. And now that Naomi's here, I think we're going to see even more of your story unfold. James smiled at the thought. Maybe this wasn't just a new chapter. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a whole new book. The morning after Naomi's surprise visit, James woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight pouring through the window seemed warmer today, brighter. His heart felt lighter too. He had spent most of the night reflecting on the conversation he'd had with Naomi, the weight of her words still lingering in his mind. The idea of a family day at the nursing home, a day to reconnect, had stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years, hope. As he dressed, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than what he had settled for. A sense of new beginnings was in the air, as though the next chapter of his life was about to unfold in ways he couldn't predict. He arrived in the common room for breakfast, which was already bustling with activity. Residents were chatting, staff were serving food, and the soft hum of conversation filled the room. But today, there was a different energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. Evelyn, as always, was making her rounds, checking in with everyone, but there was something in her step that day, a little extra bounce, as if she knew something everyone else didn't. "Good morning, James," she said cheerfully as she approached. "How are we feeling today?" James smiled, his mood noticeably lifted. "I'm doing better. Actually, I think I'm ready for today." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes next." "I've been thinking a lot about things," James replied, his voice thoughtful. "Last night with Naomi, it was eye-opening. And now, I feel like I need to do something. I don't want to just sit here waiting anymore." Evelyn's smile widened, her eyes full of understanding. "That's what I like to hear. You know, it's not just about the stories we share, James. It's about the choices we make. And I think you're starting to realize that." Just then, a small group of residents walked by, laughing and chatting. James recognized a few of them from the storytelling session. They were all older, with weathered faces that bore the marks of time, but there was something in their voices that made them sound younger, more alive. He watched as they moved past him, and for the first time, he didn't feel isolated in this place. His attention was drawn back to Evelyn, who was still standing beside him. "What would you like to do today, James?" she asked, her tone inviting. He thought for a moment. "I'd like to sit outside, if that's possible. Maybe take a walk in the garden. Just clear my head." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. "Of course. I'll make sure you have some company, too. You don't have to be alone if you don't want to be." James appreciated her thoughtfulness. He hadn't realized how much he had been avoiding the people around him until now. His time at the nursing home had been mostly spent in solitude, either reading or reflecting on his past, but now, he wanted something different. He wanted to be a part of the world again, even if it was just for a little while. Later, as he sat outside in the garden, the cool morning breeze brushing against his skin, James felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. The garden was a peaceful place, with blooming flowers and tall trees casting long, dappled shadows on the ground. He found a bench under one of the trees and sat down, closing his eyes for a moment to take in the peaceful sounds of nature. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard footsteps approaching. He opened his eyes and saw one of the residents, a man named Thomas, walking toward him. Thomas was a quiet man, often found with a book in his hands or sitting by the window, lost in thought. James had never spoken to him much, but there was something about Thomas that made him seem both distant and familiar. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas asked, his voice low but friendly. James smiled, gesturing to the empty space beside him. "Not at all. Please, have a seat." Thomas sat down, and for a few moments, neither of them said anything. The quiet was comfortable, not awkward, and James appreciated the peace it brought. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You know," he said, his gaze fixed on the flowers in front of them, "I've been here for a while now, more years than I care to count. And I can tell you something about this place, something most people don't realize when they first come here." James turned toward him, intrigued. "What's that?" Thomas looked at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "This place isn't just a stop along the way to the end. It's a chance to learn, to grow, to find something you didn't know you were missing. You're starting to see that, aren't you?" James felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so focused on what he was leaving behind that he hadn't realized the potential of what lay ahead. "I think I am," he said quietly. "I think I've been looking at it all wrong." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. We all do at first. It's easy to get caught up in what's gone, in what you think you've lost. But there's so much more waiting for you if you're willing to see it. James sat back on the bench, taking a deep breath. The weight of Thomas's words hung in the air, but instead of feeling heavy, they felt like a gentle nudge, urging him forward. You've got a lot of life left, James, Thomas added, his voice softer now. Don't waste it. James turned to him, a newfound clarity in his eyes. I won't, he said, his voice steady. I won't. As the morning stretched on, James sat there, lost in the peaceful atmosphere of the garden. The weight of his past seemed lighter today, and the path ahead appeared clearer. He was ready to face whatever came next, with open eyes and an open heart. The days that followed James' moment of clarity felt different, lighter, somehow. He moved through each day with a renewed sense of purpose, as if the weight of years of regret and missed opportunities had finally been lifted. The garden walks became a routine for him, a quiet escape from the chaos of thoughts that often clouded his mind. But this time, he walked with intention, each step bringing him closer to something he hadn't realized he was searching for. Naomi had been right, he thought. It wasn't too late for him to live fully, to embrace whatever time he had left. He'd spent so many years convinced that the best parts of his life were behind him, that he had nothing left to offer. But sitting on that bench, speaking to Thomas, he realized that wasn't true. Not by a long shot. On one particular afternoon, Naomi came to visit again. She had promised to bring the grandchildren with her this time, and the excitement in her voice when she had called made James smile even before she arrived. The thought of seeing his grandchildren again filled him with a joy he hadn't felt in years. It was strange how time had stolen so much from him. Yet now, in this place, it seemed to be giving him something back. As Naomi and the children entered the nursing home's front doors, James rose from his bench in the garden to greet them. The moment his eyes landed on his grandchildren, a wave of emotion rushed over him. He had missed them, missed the way their laughter filled a room, missed the innocence in their eyes, and the way they saw the world with wonder. "Grandpa!" they shouted in unison, rushing toward him. The younger of the two, a little girl with pigtails and a dress full of flowers, threw her arms around his legs. The older boy, who was a few years older and already beginning to show signs of his own unique personality, gave him a big hug and a goofy grin. James chuckled, his heart swelling. He bent down to their level, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Well, look at you two," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've gotten so big since I last saw you." Naomi smiled, standing a few paces behind her children. There was a softness in her eyes, a look of pride as she watched James interact with the kids. "I thought this would be a good place for us to meet," she said. "We can have lunch here, and then maybe take a walk around. What do you think, Dad?" James nodded, his throat tight with unshed tears. "I think that sounds perfect. I'm glad you brought them here. This place, it feels different when I'm with you all." Naomi walked over and took his arm, guiding him back toward the nursing home's dining area. As they made their way through the hallways, James couldn't help but notice how much more vibrant the nursing home seemed with the laughter and energy of children filling the space. The walls, which had once seemed cold and sterile, now felt warmer, softer. The sterile air was filled with the hum of life, and he felt alive, in a way he hadn't in a long time. When they reached the dining area, the table was set with simple but comforting food. It wasn't gourmet, but it was filling, and it was enough to remind James that there was value in the small things. Naomi sat beside him, and the grandchildren chattered on about their day, their excitement infectious. As they ate, Naomi noticed the way her father's eyes lit up when he talked to the children. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen him so engaged, so present. The nursing home, she thought, had done more for him than just provide care. It had given him the space to reconnect with his family, with himself. Later, after the meal was over, Naomi suggested they take a walk through the gardens. James agreed eagerly, his heart swelling with gratitude for this chance to connect with his grandchildren and daughter. As they walked, Naomi noticed the way he looked at the flowers, the trees, the sky as if seeing them for the first time. "You know, Dad," she said quietly, I wasn't sure how this would work out. I thought maybe you'd resist the idea of being here, but I see something different now. You seem happy, really happy." James looked at her, his face softening. "I didn't expect it either, Naomi. But being here, I feel like I've been given a second chance. A chance to really live, to make the most of what I've got left." She squeezed his arm gently. "I'm glad you feel that way, Dad. I think this place is exactly where you need to be." The children, ahead of them, were running around the garden, their laughter echoing off the walls. James watched them for a moment, then turned to Naomi. "You know," he said slowly, "I've spent a lot of time worrying about what I've lost. But I realize now that it's not about the things I've lost. It's about what I still have. I have you, and the kids, and I have today. I still have time." Naomi's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She had always known her father had a big heart, but she had never truly understood how deeply it had been buried beneath years of hurt and loss. To see him embrace the possibility of happiness again was a gift she would never take for granted. James paused for a moment, then added with a soft chuckle, "And I've got some good stories left in me, too. I'm not done yet." Naomi laughed. "You never were, Dad." As they walked together in silence, the world around them seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. James had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of it. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had his family, his memories, and a chance to make new ones. And that, he thought, was enough. The next few weeks were a blur of small moments that felt large in their significance. James had grown accustomed to his new routine at the nursing home. He spent his mornings in the garden, watching the seasons change with a kind of quiet appreciation. There were still moments of loneliness, of course, but they were balanced by the visits from Naomi and the children, and by the growing sense that this place, though once unfamiliar and frightening, was starting to feel like home. One morning, as James sat on his usual bench under the shade of a tall oak tree, Thomas approached him with a friendly smile. The older man had been a constant companion since James' arrival, and their conversations had deepened over time. Thomas was a retired history teacher who had spent much of his life traveling the world, and his stories always fascinated James. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas asked, his voice warm as he slid onto the bench beside him. "Of course, you're always welcome," James replied, his face lighting up with a smile. He had come to appreciate Thomas's quiet wisdom and easygoing nature. It felt good to have someone to talk to again, someone who didn't treat him like he was fragile or lost. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the birds flit between the trees. Then, Thomas broke the quiet. "You know, James, I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful. "I know you've been here for a while now, and I've seen a real change in you. When you first arrived, you seemed a little withdrawn. But now, you've got a spark in your eyes. You're more alive than I've seen you in years." James chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Maybe it's the fresh air," he joked. "Or maybe I've just realized there's more to life than I gave it credit for." Thomas nodded, his eyes twinkling. "That's what I was thinking. You know, I've spent a lot of my time reading about the past, histories of kings and empires, revolutions, battles. But you," he paused, glancing at James, "you've got a history of your own, and I think it's still unfolding." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," Thomas continued, "you've got more life to live. There are still stories waiting to be written in your life. You've still got time to make a difference, to do things you haven't done yet. It's never too late, James. Not for anyone." James looked at his friend for a long moment, considering his words. The idea had taken root in his mind over the last few days, the notion that there was more to his life than what had already passed. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet. "I don't know what that difference could be," James said slowly. "I'm no young man anymore. What could someone like me still offer the world?" "You'd be surprised," Thomas said with a smile. "It's not always about grand gestures. Sometimes, the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. And sometimes, it's the people we touch along the way who make the difference." James leaned back on the bench, letting Thomas's words settle in his mind. It was a notion that resonated deeply with him. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps his time here, in this nursing home, was part of a larger story he had yet to fully understand. He had always been a man of action, a man who had prided himself on providing for his family, on doing what was expected of him. But now, in this quieter chapter of his life, it seemed there was an opportunity to do something different. Later that afternoon, as Naomi arrived with the children in tow, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The children ran toward him as they always did, eager for his attention, and James found himself laughing with them, caught up in their infectious energy. "Grandpa, guess what?" his grandson Eli said excitedly. "I made a drawing of you." "Oh, really?" James asked, leaning down to look at the crumpled piece of paper Eli held out to him. "Well, let's see it." Eli beamed and handed him the drawing. It was simple, a crude sketch of a man with a big smile and a hat, James' hat. The child had clearly drawn him from memory, and despite its simplicity, the picture warmed James' heart. "You're quite the artist, Eli," James said, his voice filled with pride. "I'm going to be an artist when I grow up, Grandpa," Eli declared, his eyes wide with excitement. Naomi smiled softly from behind them. "I think he's got a bit of your spirit in him, Dad," she said. James looked at his daughter and then at his grandson, feeling a surge of love and hope. Perhaps there was more to his legacy than he had thought. Perhaps his greatest contribution wouldn't be measured in the things he'd accomplished or the money he'd earned. Perhaps it would be in the lives he had touched, in the people he had shaped, and in the way his story would continue to ripple through the generations. As the afternoon wore on and the family played in the garden, James found himself thinking more about the future, about how he could make the most of the time he had left. And though he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to waste it. There were still stories to be written, still moments to be shared, and still ways for him to make a difference. And that, more than anything, gave him a sense of peace. The days had been passing more easily for James, and with each one, his sense of belonging at the nursing home grew stronger. He had found a rhythm, a peaceful routine that helped him forget, even if just for a moment, the aching of his past. Yet, every now and then, something would stir in him, a memory, a feeling that would remind him of the life he had lived before. It was one such afternoon, as he was sitting by the window, watching the golden light of late afternoon pour over the garden, that Naomi arrived, holding something in her hands. She approached him with a gentle smile, her eyes carrying a quiet excitement. "Dad, I've got something for you," Naomi said softly, sitting down beside him. She unfolded a piece of paper and handed it to him. It was an old photograph, one he hadn't seen in years. James' fingers trembled slightly as he took the photo. It was of a much younger version of himself, standing beside a woman he recognized immediately. His late wife, Clara. The photo was from their wedding day, taken so many years ago. He had almost forgotten how young they both looked, how hopeful their faces had been, full of dreams and promises for the future. Naomi noticed the way her father's gaze softened as he looked at the picture, and she smiled wistfully. "I thought you might like to see this again. I found it in an old box of your things." James' heart swelled with emotion. Clara had been his world for decades, the love of his life. The memories of their time together, both the beautiful and the painful, seemed to rise up within him, filling his chest with a bittersweet ache. But now, sitting here with his daughter, surrounded by the comfort of the nursing home, it felt like the pain of losing her had finally begun to heal. He took a deep breath and smiled at Naomi. "I'd forgotten about this photo. Clara looks as beautiful as ever." "She always was," Naomi said softly, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "I miss her too, Dad. We all do." James nodded, his gaze lingering on the photograph for a moment longer before he carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. "It's funny," he said quietly, "how memories like this can come rushing back. For a while, I thought I'd forgotten. But then, something like this happens, and it all comes flooding back." Naomi placed a hand gently on his. "You don't have to forget, Dad. You just have to let the memories be what they are, part of the journey that got you here. And you've still got plenty of life left to live." James looked out the window again, his eyes distant, lost in thought. "I suppose you're right," he said after a long pause. I suppose there's more to my story than just what I've left behind. Naomi smiled warmly, squeezing his hand. Exactly. And there's more to your story still. You've got plenty of chapters left. Later that evening, after Naomi and the children had left, James sat alone in the quiet of his room. The photo was on the bedside table, and he found himself reaching for it again. He held it up to the light, studying the faces of the young man and woman smiling back at him. Their eyes were full of promise, full of hope for the future. And for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace. Yes, there had been loss, and yes, there had been pain. But there had also been love and joy and family. And those memories were just as real, just as vivid, as the hardest moments. He placed the photo back on the table and lay down, his mind at rest. There was no need to rush through the remainder of his life. He would take it one moment at a time, savoring the days he had left, knowing that his story was far from over. As he drifted off to sleep, he found himself thinking of Clara again, of their time together, and of the future he still had ahead. It was a future he would face with hope, with the knowledge that even in the twilight of his years, there was still so much to give. The morning air had a crispness to it that James hadn't felt in a while. It was a quiet morning at the nursing home, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of anticipation. Something about the stillness of the day suggested that something unexpected was on the horizon, though he couldn't put his finger on why. As he sat in the common room, sipping his morning coffee, a nurse walked past him, her name tag reading Sarah. She stopped for a moment, smiling warmly. "James, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice cheerful. James raised an eyebrow, a bit surprised. He hadn't been expecting any visitors today, especially not at this hour. But then again, Naomi sometimes popped in during the morning, though she usually called ahead. "Who is it?" he asked, looking up from his mug. "You'll see. I think you'll be glad to have the company," Sarah said with a wink before walking off. James set his coffee down, his curiosity piqued. He couldn't imagine who it could be. Naomi had left only hours ago, and the thought of any old friends stopping by seemed unlikely. Still, the promise of company was welcome. He'd grown used to the nursing home's quiet rhythms, but the occasional surprise was always a pleasant shift. A few minutes later, the door to the common room opened, and a man stepped in. James' heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen this man in decades, not since he was a young man with dreams of his own. Standing before him, as if he had stepped out of the past, was his old friend, Curtis. "James," Curtis said, his voice a little raspy but warm, "it's been a long time." James blinked, his mind struggling to process the sight of his old friend standing there. Curtis hadn't changed much, though the years had added some gray to his hair and lines to his face. But the eyes, the same spark of mischief and determination, were unmistakable. "Curtis, is it really you?" James finally managed to say, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "In the flesh," Curtis replied with a grin. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." James stood slowly, feeling the weight of his own age, but eager to embrace the man who had once been his closest confidant. "You sure are a surprise," he said, walking over and shaking Curtis' hand firmly. "What are you doing here? Last I heard, you were living down south." "I was," Curtis said, settling into the chair beside James. "But I've been keeping an eye on things, you know? I heard about your move up here, and I thought, hell, it's time to pay you a visit." James took a seat, his mind racing. Curtis had been like a brother to him back in the day. They had been inseparable during their younger years, sharing stories, laughter, and the trials of life. James had never expected to see him again, but here he was, sitting right in front of him. "You must have 1,000 questions, James," Curtis continued, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "And I've got some answers for you. But first, I want to hear how you've been. How's life been treating you?" James took a deep breath. For a long time, he had kept his emotions buried, hidden away from the world, even from those closest to him. But seeing Curtis again stirred something inside him. He had always been able to talk to Curtis, and now, after so many years, he found himself wanting to share his journey, to unburden himself of all the things he'd kept to himself. "Well, it's been a lot," James began slowly, his voice soft but steady. After Clara passed, I had a tough time. Naomi did her best, you know? She kept me going. But when she told me she was moving me here, I won't lie, I wasn't thrilled. It felt like the end of something, like I was being put away, forgotten. Curtis nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I know what you mean. But James, you're here now. You've made it through the hardest part. James let out a heavy sigh. It's just been hard. There are days when it feels like I've lost so much of who I was. But there are good days too, you know? Days when I look out at the sky, or I spend time with Naomi, and I remember that there's still more to my life than I realized. Curtis smiled softly, his voice filled with conviction. That's what I came to tell you, James. There's more to your story. You're not done yet. Not by a long shot. James looked at his old friend, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Maybe Curtis was right. Maybe there was still more for him to discover in these final years. He had lived a long life, filled with joy and loss, but perhaps the last chapters were the ones that would define him most. I've got some plans for you, James, Curtis said, his eyes glinting with mischief. I'm not here just for a visit. I've got a few things I need to show you. You ready for an adventure? James leaned forward, intrigued and feeling a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in years. An adventure? What kind of adventure? Curtis grinned, his old self-confidence shining through. Let's just say, the world still has a few surprises for you, my friend. And for the first time in a long while, James felt a rush of anticipation, a feeling he hadn't realized he missed. Perhaps there was still time for one last adventure after all. The day after Curtis' unexpected visit, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Curtis' words lingered in his mind. The world still has a few surprises for you, my friend. It was a reminder that life didn't have to slow down just because he was in a nursing home. There were still possibilities, still a future he could shape, even in the twilight of his years. That afternoon, Naomi came by for her usual visit. James was sitting by the window, gazing out at the trees swaying in the gentle breeze. It had become a routine. Every day, Naomi would come, bringing news of the outside world, updates on family, and small gestures of love that brightened his days. But today, James was feeling different. He had more to say. Naomi stepped into the room with a warm smile, but her expression faltered as she noticed the look on her father's face. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, concern flickering in her eyes. James turned toward her, his lips curling into a half-smile. "I'm better than okay, Naomi. I've been thinking, maybe it's time I start living a little more." Naomi raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "What do you mean?" James gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down. I've got something to tell you." She complied, taking a seat and watching her father intently. She had seen him in many moods over the years, grieving, joyful, reflective. But there was something different in the air today, something hopeful. "I had a visit yesterday," James began, his voice calm but purposeful. "An old friend of mine, Curtis. He showed up out of nowhere. And Naomi, he reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Naomi's eyes widened. "Curtis? Wow, it's been ages since you mentioned him. I didn't even know he was still around. He's been living down south, but he's back now. And he told me something I needed to hear, that I'm not done yet, that I still have time, that there's more for me to do." Naomi sat back, her mind racing. This was a side of her father she hadn't seen in a while, the spark of life returning to his eyes. She had worried so much about him, about how he was adjusting to life in the nursing home. She had feared he might lose himself, become trapped in the routine of aging and caregiving. But hearing him talk about possibility, about living, it was like a weight lifting off her shoulders. "That's great, Dad," Naomi said, her voice soft but filled with genuine happiness. "So, what are you thinking? What kind of things do you want to do?" James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Curtis and I talked about it. He has plans, and I'm going to be a part of them." Naomi's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "Plans? What kind of plans?" James chuckled. "I'm not sure yet, but Curtis always has a way of making things happen. Let's just say, he's got a new adventure in mind for me." Naomi took a moment to process. She knew Curtis. He was the kind of man who never let age or obstacles stop him from pursuing what he wanted. It was just like him to show up after all these years and sweep James into something bigger than the quiet life of the nursing home. "Well, if it makes you happy, then I'm all for it," Naomi said, her tone filled with warmth. "But, Dad, promise me you'll be careful. I don't want you to get hurt. And you're not as young as you used to be." James nodded, though a gleam of excitement still twinkled in his eyes. "I know, Naomi. But sometimes, a man has to take a chance, even in his old age." Naomi smiled softly, her heart swelling with affection for her father. She had always admired his resilience, his ability to overcome hardship, and now, seeing him embrace the idea of adventure again, it made her proud. Maybe this was exactly what he needed, something to reignite his sense of purpose, something to remind him that life didn't stop just because you reached a certain age. As the day went on, James found himself filled with a sense of anticipation. He wasn't sure exactly what Curtis had in mind, but he could feel that something big was coming. He had spent so many years quietly watching life pass him by, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had the chance to seize it again. Later that evening, Naomi left for the day, promising to check in on him the next morning. James, however, wasn't ready to settle into his routine just yet. He knew that, despite all the uncertainty, something new was on the horizon. He had spent too many years putting off his dreams, his desires, his hopes for the future. But no more. The next chapter of his life was waiting to be written, and he was going to make it count. That night, after the lights had dimmed in the nursing home and the quiet settled over the building, James sat by the window again, looking out at the stars. For the first time in a long while, he felt like there was still so much left to discover. He didn't know exactly where this new path would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. It was time for him to find out. Tomorrow, he would start his next adventure. And this time, he wasn't going to wait. The morning came too soon, but for once, James didn't mind. He had barely slept the night before, excitement coursing through his veins. Curtis' visit, his words, and the promise of a new chapter. It was all he could think about. The idea of change, of something beyond the confines of the nursing home, was a breath of fresh air. He had spent so many months in a quiet, predictable routine, and now, suddenly, there was a chance to break free. Naomi arrived promptly, as she always did, but today, her father's energy was palpable. She couldn't help but notice the change in him the moment she stepped into his room. James was sitting upright in his chair, his usual relaxed posture replaced by one of alertness and purpose. "Good morning, Dad," Naomi greeted, her voice carrying the warmth she always brought. "You're up early, and you seem different." James grinned, his eyes twinkling. "That's because I am. I've got news for you." Naomi raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of news?" James leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "Curtis, he wants me to go with him on an adventure. I'm going to join him. I'm not sure of the details yet, but he's got something in the works, and I'm going to be a part of it." Naomi's eyes widened in surprise. "Wait, what? You're leaving? But Dad, I thought you were okay here." "I am, Naomi," James interjected, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to let my age keep me from living." Curtis reminded me of something. I don't have to just sit here and wait for the days to pass. I want to make the most of what I have left. Naomi stared at him, momentarily speechless. She had always been the protective daughter, the one who ensured her father's comfort and safety. The thought of him stepping into the unknown, embarking on an adventure at his age, made her anxious. But she also saw the spark in his eyes, the same spark that had always driven him, that had kept him strong through every challenge. She had to admit, she was proud of him for wanting more. "That's amazing, Dad," Naomi finally said, though her voice was laced with concern. "But are you sure? I mean, we've talked about how much you like it here, how comfortable you are. What if it's too much?" James gave her a reassuring smile. "I've thought about it, Naomi. This is a big step, I know. But I can't sit here and wonder what if anymore. If I don't do it now, I might never get the chance." Naomi nodded slowly, her heart swelling with mixed emotions. She understood his desire to seize the moment. She had always admired his strength, but the protective daughter in her struggled to let go. Still, she knew deep down that this was part of his journey, and if he felt it was right for him, she would support him. "You've always been independent, Dad," Naomi said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I guess I shouldn't hold you back now. But promise me one thing. Stay safe, and let me know what's going on. I want to be a part of this with you, even if I can't be there physically." James reached out, taking her hand in his. "You'll always be a part of it, Naomi. You've been with me through every step of my life. Nothing changes that." Naomi squeezed his hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. She smiled through it, wiping it away. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I really am. Just be careful, okay?" "I will," James promised. "I'll keep you updated, I swear. Now, you go about your day. I'm going to make a few calls." Naomi hesitated, glancing at her father one more time before turning toward the door. She wasn't sure she fully understood his decision, but she knew it was his to make. She didn't want to stand in his way. And maybe, just maybe, this adventure would be exactly what he needed to keep living with purpose. As Naomi left the room, James sat back in his chair, a sense of determination settling over him. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to waste another minute feeling sorry for himself or letting the world pass him by. Whatever Curtis had in store, he was ready for it. His fingers hovered over the phone, and after a brief moment, he dialed the number he knew so well, the one that would set everything in motion. Curtis answered on the second ring, his voice as enthusiastic as ever. Well, James. I was wondering when you'd call. You ready to take the plunge?" James chuckled, the weight of his decision finally feeling right. "I'm in, Curtis. Let's do it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Curtis let out a whoop of excitement. "That's what I like to hear. I knew you'd be up for it. I'll send you the details, and we'll get everything rolling. This is going to be one hell of a ride." James hung up the phone, a grin spreading across his face. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive with possibility. The adventure was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. As he stood up from his chair, stretching his limbs and taking a deep breath, he couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something truly incredible. Tomorrow, he would take his first step into the unknown. And this time, he wasn't looking back. James woke up early the next morning, the sun barely peeking through the curtains. He felt a rush of energy he hadn't experienced in years. His mind was buzzing with thoughts of the adventure ahead, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was eager to face the day. The decision to take this leap, to break away from the comfort of the nursing home and all that he had known, had filled him with a sense of purpose that he hadn't realized he was missing. Naomi had left a note on the kitchen counter, just as she always did when she had to leave early for work. It was short, but filled with love and care. "Dad, I hope today brings you closer to your dreams. I'm proud of you for going after what you want. I love you always." James smiled softly, the note in his hand. He could hear the worry in her words, but he knew it was more about her protective instincts than anything else. She had always been the one to ensure his well-being, to take care of him. But now, it was his turn to show her that he could still take care of himself, and that he wasn't ready to settle for a life of routine and stagnation. He made himself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth of the mug as he stared out the window. His phone buzzed with a message from Curtis, the excitement in his words contagious. "Hey James, I've got the details for you. We're meeting tomorrow morning at the spot I told you about. Be there at 9 a.m. sharp. This is going to be one for the books, my friend." James read the message twice, letting the anticipation build. Tomorrow was the day. It was time for him to step into the unknown, to embrace the adventure that Curtis had promised. He wasn't exactly sure what awaited him, but that was part of the thrill. After all, what good was life if you didn't take chances? He finished his coffee and went through his morning routine, packing his things in a small bag. He wasn't sure how long this journey would last, but he didn't need much. A few essentials, a change of clothes, and of course, his phone. He wanted to stay in touch with Naomi and keep her updated, even if she was worried. Around midday, Curtis called again. "Just wanted to check in and make sure you're all set, James." You good to go? James chuckled. I'm good. I'm ready for whatever comes next. Curtis's laughter rang through the phone. I like the sound of that. I'll see you tomorrow morning, my friend. It's going to be epic. After they hung up, James felt a moment of hesitation. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. A flicker of doubt. Was he making the right choice? Was he ready for whatever Curtis had planned? But then he shook his head, dismissing the doubt. He couldn't let fear hold him back. He had spent too much of his life letting comfort dictate his choices. Now, it was time to take control. That evening, as he lay in bed, he reflected on the journey he was about to embark on. He thought of Naomi, how she would react to the news when he finally told her. He knew she'd be worried, but he hoped she'd come to understand. The world was so much bigger than the small room he had spent so much time in. There was still so much left to experience, so many places to see, and people to meet. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too old to do it. The sound of his phone buzzing broke his thoughts. It was a message from Naomi. Dad, I know I've been a little overprotective lately, but I want you to know that I trust you. You've always been strong, and I know you'll be okay. Just be safe, and don't forget to keep me updated. Love you. James smiled as he read the message. It was exactly what he needed to hear. He quickly typed a response. I love you too, Naomi. And don't worry, I'll be just fine. I'll keep you posted, I promise. With that, he set his phone down and settled into the bed. For the first time in a long while, sleep came easily. He was no longer weighed down by the fears of aging or the uncertainty of the future. Instead, he was filled with the excitement of what was to come. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he would take the first step into a new chapter of his life. The morning light broke through the curtains as James slowly opened his eyes. He felt an unfamiliar excitement buzzing through his veins, a spark he hadn't felt in years. Today was the day that would mark the beginning of something new, something unexpected. He sat up in bed and stretched, feeling the slight ache in his joints. But there was no pain that could dull the anticipation he felt. He had made up his mind. The journey ahead was his to take, and he was ready for it. After a quick shower, he dressed in a pair of comfortable jeans and a shirt he hadn't worn in ages. It was his favorite, a faded blue button-up that reminded him of his younger days, before life had slowed him down. He checked his phone. A message from Curtis popped up. Don't forget, we're meeting at the spot in 1 hour. It's going to be a good one, I promise. James smiled at the enthusiasm in Curtis's message. There was something infectious about the way Curtis approached life. So full of energy, always looking for the next adventure. James had admired that about him for years. Now, it was his turn to embrace it. He grabbed his bag, checked that he had everything, and headed out the door. The cool morning air hit his face as he stepped outside, and he took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fresh beginnings. The drive to the meeting point was short, and as James arrived, he saw Curtis's familiar car parked in front of the old warehouse they had talked about. Curtis was already standing outside, grinning from ear to ear. You made it, Curtis called out as James approached. I wouldn't miss it for the world, James replied, shaking Curtis's hand. They exchanged pleasantries, but the excitement was palpable. James could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just another errand, another task to complete. This was an adventure, one that would change everything. Curtis led him inside the warehouse, where a small group of people were gathered. James felt a mix of curiosity and nervousness. These were strangers to him, but he could tell they all shared the same spark of excitement that Curtis exuded. All right, everybody, gather round. Curtis called out to the group. This is James. He's joining us for the first time today, so let's make him feel welcome. James offered a smile to the group, and they all greeted him warmly. There was a feeling of camaraderie that he hadn't expected, and it eased his nerves a little. These were people who, like Curtis, sought something beyond the ordinary. They weren't content with just going through the motions of life. Curtis clapped his hands together, drawing everyone's attention. Now, let me explain what we're about to do. We're going on a little trip today, something that's going to test your limits, challenge your perceptions. I promise you, it's going to be unlike anything you've ever experienced. James's heart rate quickened. What had he gotten himself into? But there was no turning back now. He was here, and he was committed. After a brief introduction to the group, Curtis handed out gear, helmets, ropes, and harnesses. It was then that James realized this wasn't just a casual outing. They were going on some kind of extreme adventure, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant yet. As they piled into a couple of cars and drove toward the location, James sat quietly in the back seat, his mind racing. This wasn't how he had imagined spending his retirement years. But there was something thrilling about stepping outside the boundaries of his comfortable life. This was the kind of experience that made him feel alive again. The drive took them into the countryside, away from the city. They passed through rolling hills, forests, and open fields until they reached a remote location at the base of a steep mountain. James's stomach did a flip when he saw what was in front of him. A giant cliff face, its jagged edges reaching high into the sky. There was a sense of awe in the air, and for a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the enormity of it. "You all right, James?" Curtis asked, noticing his hesitation. James looked over at him, taking a deep breath. "I'm fine, just trying to take it all in." Curtis grinned. "That's the spirit. We're going to be climbing this," he said, pointing to the cliff face. James's heart skipped a beat. Climbing? At his age? But something inside him, something deep and primal, stirred at the thought. This was it. This was the challenge he had been looking for. "You've got this, James," Curtis said, his voice full of encouragement. "You're stronger than you think." For the first time in a long time, James believed him. The doubts, the fears, they began to fade. Today was about more than just climbing a mountain. It was about pushing through the limits he had placed on himself, breaking free of the chains of fear and uncertainty. He nodded to Curtis. "Let's do it." With that, they began to prepare for the climb. James's hands shook slightly as he strapped on the harness, but there was no turning back now. This was his chance to prove to himself that he was still capable, still strong, still alive. As they started the ascent, the air grew thinner, and the climb became more challenging. But with every step, James felt a sense of accomplishment, of rising above the doubts that had held him back for so long. And in that moment, as his hands gripped the rock and his feet found solid footing, James realized that this was more than just a climb. It was the first step toward a new life. A life filled with challenges, yes, but also with the possibility of greatness. James's hands were slick with sweat as he clung to the rock face, his muscles burning from the strain. But the higher he climbed, the more alive he felt. There was something exhilarating about this challenge, something that made the years fall away, leaving him with only the present moment. He glanced down briefly, but the dizzying drop below made his stomach turn. He quickly refocused on the path ahead, finding his next foothold, his next grip. Curtis, already several feet above him, called down, "You're doing great, James. Just keep going." James nodded, though Curtis couldn't see him. The sound of his own breathing and the steady rhythm of his movements were the only things he could focus on now. He had to make it to the top, not just for Curtis, not just for the group, but for himself. The mountain seemed to test him, presenting obstacles that challenged his endurance. At times, his hands slipped and his feet faltered, but he refused to give in to the frustration rising within him. Each time he stumbled, he found his footing again, pushing through the discomfort. He couldn't turn back now. After what felt like hours, James finally reached the summit. His heart was racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but he made it. He pulled himself up onto the flat rock surface, the wind rushing past his ears as he sat down, the world sprawling out below him. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of forest, hills, and valleys, stretching as far as the eye could see. The beauty of it took his breath away, and for a moment, he forgot everything. His age, his doubts, even the years of self-imposed limitations. Curtis reached the top just a few minutes after James, his grin wide as he took in the scenery. "Told you it would be worth it," he exclaimed, giving James a hearty slap on the back. James laughed, the sound echoing into the wind. "You weren't kidding," he said, his voice filled with awe. This is incredible." They sat together in silence for a few moments, both absorbing the grandeur of the landscape. For James, it was more than just a physical achievement. it was a symbolic one. He had spent so many years doubting himself, staying within the comfortable confines of his home, afraid to take risks, to push his limits. But today, that was all changing. He wasn't the man he once was, and yet, in this moment, he realized that he was still capable of so much more than he had ever imagined. "James, this is just the beginning," Curtis said, his voice thoughtful now. "You've got so much ahead of you. This is what life is all about, pushing yourself, discovering what you're made of, and embracing the unknown." James nodded, his heart swelling with a newfound sense of possibility. "I never thought I could do something like this," he admitted. "But now I see that I'm not done yet." Curtis smiled. "No, not by a long shot. You've just begun." The wind whipped around them as they sat there, taking in the view and letting the sense of accomplishment wash over them. James's heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just existing, he was living. And it was exhilarating. After a while, Curtis stood up and stretched. "All right, I think it's time to head down. We've still got a ways to go today, and I know you're not ready to quit just yet, right?" James chuckled. "No, I'm not. Let's do it." They began the descent, carefully making their way down the cliff face. James was surprised to find that the way down wasn't nearly as difficult as the climb up. Perhaps it was because he had already proven to himself that he was capable, or maybe it was simply the fact that he was riding the high of his success. Whatever the reason, he moved with confidence now, each step feeling lighter than the last. As they reached the base of the mountain, the group that had been waiting for them cheered. James couldn't help but grin, feeling a rush of pride. They had all completed the climb together, and while he had been nervous at first, he now understood the power of collective strength. Curtis slapped him on the back again, laughing. "See? Told you. You're a natural." James didn't respond immediately, instead looking back up at the towering mountain they had just conquered. There was something symbolic about it, a metaphor for the challenges he had faced in his life. Just like the climb, the obstacles had seemed insurmountable at times. But with persistence, determination, and a little help from those around him, he had overcome them. "I didn't think I could do it," James finally said, his voice quiet but filled with wonder. "But I did. And now I know I can do anything." Curtis smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit." As the group packed up their gear and prepared to head back, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew this experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't just the mountain he had conquered. It was the fears, the doubts, the limitations he had placed on himself. Today, he had torn them down, brick by brick, and as he walked back to the cars, feeling the weight of the accomplishment settle in his bones, he knew this was only the beginning. Whatever challenges came next, he was ready. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The drive back was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that comes after a shared triumph. James sat in the front seat, gazing out the window at the world rushing by. The mountains, which had seemed so distant and imposing just hours earlier, now seemed like mere hills in the rearview mirror. Curtis drove, his hands relaxed on the wheel, but every now and then, he would glance over at James, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. It was as if he, too, understood that something had shifted in James during their climb. There was a transformation in the air, something unspoken, yet undeniable. James had felt it, too. He had never imagined himself at this point, conquering a mountain, surrounded by people who believed in him, feeling a sense of freedom and possibility that had eluded him for so long. It was as though the walls he had built around himself were finally starting to crumble, bit by bit. He wasn't just the man his daughter thought he was. He wasn't just the old man who had been afraid to take risks. He was something more now, someone more. As the car continued to roll down the winding roads, Curtis spoke up, breaking the comfortable silence. "You know, James, you've got a lot more in you than you think. What you did today, it's not just about climbing a mountain. It's about everything else in your life." James turned to face him, meeting his eyes for a moment before looking back out the window. "I know," he said slowly, "but it feels different now. Like I've been waiting for something, and I didn't even know what it was." Curtis nodded, understanding. I think we all get stuck sometimes. We get into routines, start thinking that things are the way they are, and that's it. But you've shown yourself that you're not done yet. There's a whole new chapter waiting for you. James smiled, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know if I'm ready for another chapter, Curtis. I've lived a long time, you know? I've had my share of ups and downs. You don't have to be ready, James, Curtis said with a chuckle. Sometimes the best things in life happen when you're least expecting them. Just look at today. Did you expect to make it to the top of that mountain? James laughed, the sound light and free. No, not at all. I thought I was crazy for even trying. Well, you're not crazy, Curtis said, his voice serious now. You just had to see what you were capable of. Now you know. James was silent for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. There was so much more he had yet to experience. So many things he had pushed aside because of fear, because of doubt. The mountain had shown him that age wasn't a limit. His health wasn't a limit. His past wasn't a limit. The only real limit was what he believed was possible. And right now, he believed in the possibility of more. We're almost there, Curtis said, breaking James's reverie as they approached the small town where they had parked the car. You ready to get back to the group? James nodded, but there was a new calmness about him. He was ready, yes, but more than that, he was open. Open to new experiences, open to the future, open to whatever came next. As they pulled into the parking lot, the rest of the group was already waiting by the vehicles. They cheered as James and Curtis approached, their faces filled with admiration and pride. James stepped out of the car, feeling like he was stepping into a new life. The air was different now, as though the world itself had shifted along with him. There was a sense of freedom in the way he walked, a spring in his step that hadn't been there before. Curtis clapped him on the back once more. You did it, James. And I think this is just the start. I think you're right, James said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. I'm just getting started. As the group began to load their gear into the cars, ready to head home, James took a moment to look around, soaking in the scenery one last time. The mountains in the distance were a reminder of the challenges he had overcome, but also of the ones still to come. Life was like that, a constant series of peaks and valleys, but it was up to him whether he stayed at the base or kept climbing. Today, he had climbed higher than he ever thought possible. And tomorrow, he would climb even higher. He was ready. The drive home was quieter than the journey up, but the silence was filled with a new kind of energy. James sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the passing landscape. The world seemed different somehow, familiar, but also fresh, as though his eyes were seeing it for the first time. He had expected exhaustion after such an intense day, but what he felt instead was a deep sense of peace. The fatigue was there, of course. His muscles ached, and his body longed for rest, but his mind, his spirit, felt lighter than it had in years. It was as if the climb had shaken something loose inside of him, something that had been weighed down for far too long. Curtis, driving, noticed the change in James's demeanor and smiled to himself. He had seen this transformation before. He had witnessed it in his own life, and now he was watching it unfold before him in James. Sometimes all it took was a single moment, a single decision, to open the door to something new. And James had opened that door wide. James, Curtis said, breaking the silence, you realize you just did something a lot of people wouldn't have the guts to do, right? James turned to look at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. I never thought of it like that, he replied. I had to try. Something told me I could. Curtis chuckled. That's the thing, isn't it? Sometimes you have to listen to that little voice inside you. You'd be surprised what you can do when you stop doubting yourself. James nodded, his gaze shifting back to the road ahead. The words settled deep inside him. Doubt had been his constant companion for so long, and today, for the first time in a long while, he had chosen to leave it behind. When they arrived back at the town, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light across the streets. The group had already dispersed, returning to their homes and lives, but James didn't feel a sense of sadness. He felt a sense of accomplishment. He had done something he never thought possible, and the sense of pride he felt was something no one could take away from him. Curtis pulled into the driveway of the house where they had been staying and parked the car. You know, Curtis said as he turned off the engine, there's more out there for you, James. You've just got to decide to go for it. James raised an eyebrow, turning his full attention to Curtis. What do you mean? I mean, Curtis continued, this isn't the end of the road for you. It's just the beginning. There's a whole world of possibilities waiting for you. You can travel, meet new people, try new things. You don't have to let age or fear keep you from living your best life. James took in Curtis's words, feeling the weight of them settle on him. He had always thought of himself as someone who had lived most of his life. But what Curtis was saying felt like a revelation. Maybe he hadn't lived most of his life after all. Maybe the best was yet to come. For the first time in years, James wasn't afraid of what the future held. He was curious, eager even, to see what came next. He was ready to take the next step, whatever that might be. After a moment of silence, James spoke again. You're right. I've been holding back for too long. Maybe it's time to stop doing that. Curtis smiled, reaching for the door handle. I think that's a great idea. Let's see where the next chapter takes you. James stepped out of the car, feeling a surge of excitement flood his chest. He wasn't sure what the next chapter would look like, but he was no longer afraid to find out. As he made his way to the front door of the house, he turned to look at the setting sun once more, feeling its warmth on his face. He had conquered the mountain. Now, it was time to conquer whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to the journey ahead. The following days felt like a breath of fresh air. For James, the weight that had long clung to his heart seemed to have been lifted. His thoughts, once clouded with doubt, now felt clear and purposeful. The excitement of the climb had sparked something inside him, something that had lain dormant for too long. The question that had once haunted him, "What now?" had begun to fade, replaced by a new, quieter voice. What's next? The morning after their return, James woke up with an unexpected sense of anticipation. He could hear the birds outside his window, the soft rustling of the trees, and the hum of the world waking up. But inside, there was a different kind of hum, a new energy, a quiet but undeniable sense that today could be the beginning of something. Curtis, ever the supportive friend, had made it a point to check in with James the morning after their return. He had seen the spark in James's eyes, and he knew that this new phase of his life wouldn't be one that could be ignored. Curtis had always believed that people could change, could reinvent themselves, if they had the courage to do so. And James had proven that courage in ways he hadn't imagined. James picked up the phone when Curtis called, still feeling the warmth of the mountain climb in his bones. Hey, how's it going? Curtis's voice came through, steady and friendly. Good, real good, James replied. Actually, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. Curtis grinned on the other end. I knew it. You've got that look in your voice. What's going on? James sat down at the kitchen table, glancing out the window. I think you're right. I've spent too many years letting fear run my life, but I don't want to keep doing that. I'm not done yet. There's more I want to do. See? That's the spirit. Curtis was pleased, but not surprised. So, what are you thinking? James paused, a small smile forming on his lips. He had always been someone who needed a little time to process, but now, the answer was clear. I want to start small, but I need to do something big. Maybe travel some, meet new people, but also, I want to make sure I'm giving back. I want to find a way to help others, especially those who are going through what I went through. I've got a lot to offer, and I haven't been sharing it. Curtis's voice softened with admiration. I think that's a great idea, James. Helping others is always a way to help yourself too. James felt a surge of determination in his chest. He had spent so many years looking inward, wrestling with his own doubts and limitations. Now, he was ready to turn that focus outward, to put his energy into others, into building something meaningful that could not only change his life, but also make a difference in the lives of those who felt just as stuck as he once did. Thanks, Curtis. I'm really glad I did this. The climb, it's given me a new perspective, and I'm ready to see where it leads me. Curtis laughed softly. You've got this, James. I know you do. After the call ended, James sat quietly for a moment, contemplating his next steps. He had always known he wanted to help others, but it wasn't until now, until after the mountain climb, that he realized just how much he had to offer. The things he had learned over his life, the wisdom gained from years of experience, now felt like gifts he could share. A few days later, he started planning. He researched volunteering opportunities and local programs, looked into mentorship roles, and even considered traveling to places where his experiences could have the most impact. There was no rush. He knew it was a process, one that would take time. But he also knew that this was the beginning of something bigger than he had imagined. One evening, after another productive day of planning, James sat back in his chair and smiled. The sun had set, and the room was bathed in the soft glow of the lamp beside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, on the edge of something wonderful. He had never expected the journey he had begun to unfold so beautifully. But now, with each passing day, he felt more certain that the best was yet to come. The weeks that followed felt like an exhilarating ride, with James embracing the new path he had set for himself. His decision to volunteer and mentor people in need filled him with a sense of purpose he had never quite experienced before. Each day brought a new opportunity to share his story, his lessons, and his perspective. And it felt like every small step was a step closer to something even bigger. Yet, as much as he found joy in his local efforts, there was something stirring inside him. It was a quiet whisper in the back of his mind, a call to explore the wider world. The road beckoned him, and the idea of traveling, of seeing new places and meeting new people, began to take root in his heart. He had always been someone who thrived on routine, but now he felt the thrill of the unknown. One evening, as he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, the sky painted in hues of purple and orange, James picked up the phone and dialed Curtis's number. "Hey, buddy, how's everything going?" Curtis answered, his voice warm and familiar. "Good, good," James said, tapping his fingers on the edge of his cup. "Listen, I've been thinking. I need to go. I think I'm ready to take the plunge and travel." Curtis was quiet for a moment, processing James's words. Travel? Like a vacation kind of thing? James chuckled softly. "No, not a vacation. I mean, I want to get out there, meet people, experience different cultures, see things I've never seen before. I feel like there's so much more I can learn, and I don't want to wait any longer." There was a long pause before Curtis responded, his voice filled with a mix of pride and excitement. "You know, I think that's a fantastic idea, James. You've always had a thirst for knowledge, and this could be the perfect way to open your eyes to even more. It'll be good for you. I know it." James smiled, feeling the support in Curtis's words. It was one of the things he appreciated most about his friend. Curtis always believed in him, even when James wasn't sure he believed in himself. "I'm glad you think so," James said. "I've been looking into places I can go, and I'm thinking of starting with a volunteer program that takes you to different countries to help build sustainable communities. It's something that aligns with what I've been doing locally, but on a global scale." "That sounds incredible," Curtis replied, his voice growing more enthusiastic. "You've always wanted to make a real difference, and this sounds like the perfect way to do that. Where are you thinking of going first?" James leaned back in his chair, gazing up at the stars that were beginning to twinkle in the night sky. "I'm thinking about somewhere in Africa, maybe Kenya or Tanzania. They've got some incredible programs that focus on empowering local communities. It's a big step, but it feels right." "That's amazing," Curtis said. "You're going to do great things over there, James. I just know it." After the call ended, James sat in silence for a few moments, contemplating the journey ahead. He had always been someone who preferred to stay in his comfort zone, to avoid taking risks. But now, for the first time in years, he felt an overwhelming sense of adventure stirring in his soul. The world felt vast and full of possibilities, and he was eager to explore it. In the days that followed, James began making arrangements for his travels. He researched volunteer programs, reached out to organizations, and started planning the details of his trip. He was both excited and nervous. He had never done anything like this before. But the thought of immersing himself in a completely different culture, of making a difference on a global scale, fueled his determination. As the departure date drew nearer, James felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had already taken. The climb had been the turning point, the spark that had reignited the fire inside him. And now, As he prepared for this next chapter, he knew that his purpose was just beginning to unfold. He stood in front of his house one last time before he left, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of his neighborhood. It was a place that had shaped him, that had witnessed his struggles and triumphs. But now, it was time to say goodbye, at least for a little while. The open road called to him, and he was ready to answer. With a deep breath, he turned away from the house and headed toward the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, James was ready to face it with open arms and a full heart. The morning of James's departure was filled with the kind of quiet energy that only accompanies a major life change. He had spent the previous night packing his bags, checking and rechecking the travel details, making sure everything was in order. But now, with the sun rising and casting golden rays across his small house, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, and yet it still felt surreal. Curtis had promised to drive him to the airport. As the car rolled down the familiar streets of their hometown, James gazed out of the window, taking in the scenery one last time. The town had been his foundation, the place where he had built his life, struggled, and triumphed. But now, it felt like a chapter was closing. "You sure you're ready for this?" Curtis asked, glancing at him as he navigated the early morning traffic. James nodded, though the nerves were undeniable. "I think so, but it's still hard to believe. It's one thing to think about it, but another to actually do it." Curtis gave a knowing smile. "Yeah, I get that. But look at it this way. This is the kind of thing people talk about years down the road. They'll say, 'I knew James before he went on to change the world.' And you'll be able to say, 'Yeah, I did that.'" James laughed, feeling a wave of gratitude toward his friend. Curtis had always been there for him, offering support and encouragement when he needed it most. Even now, as James prepared to embark on a journey that would take him far from everything he knew, Curtis's words grounded him. "I appreciate it, man," James said quietly. "You've always had my back." "No problem," Curtis replied. "You know I'm proud of you. Go out there, make a difference, and come back with stories that'll knock us all out." When they arrived at the airport, Curtis parked and they both stepped out of the car. James's bag, packed with essentials for a long trip, was slung over his shoulder. He felt a slight pang in his chest as he looked at Curtis one last time. "You take care of yourself, all right?" Curtis said. "Don't forget to keep in touch. I want to hear all about this adventure." James grinned, feeling a rush of emotion. "I'll send postcards, and I'll keep you updated. And when I get back, we'll catch up over a drink and swap stories." The two friends shared a heartfelt hug, a moment of quiet understanding passing between them. As James walked into the terminal, he felt the weight of the journey ahead. This wasn't just a physical trip, it was a journey of the soul, one that would transform him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The flight was long, but James spent much of it reflecting on the changes he had made in his life. It was strange to think how far he had come, from a man stuck in a rut, struggling to find purpose, to someone who was now on his way to a completely different world. He couldn't help but think of his family back home, and of his father, who had always dreamed of something greater for him. Perhaps, in a way, this was a fulfillment of that dream. As the plane finally touched down in Nairobi, Kenya, the reality of the adventure hit him full force. The city was bustling with life, its streets crowded with people, cars, and the sounds of commerce. But amidst the energy of the city, James felt a sense of calm. This was where he was meant to be. He had signed up for a program that would take him into rural communities, helping build infrastructure and provide education on sustainable farming techniques. It was a far cry from the life he had known, but it felt right. Each step he took was one closer to a future he had never even imagined. The first few days were a whirlwind of orientation and introductions, but as James settled into the rhythm of his new surroundings, he felt his excitement growing. The people he met were kind, welcoming, and eager to work alongside him. He quickly formed bonds with his fellow volunteers, a diverse group of individuals who shared his passion for making a difference. And then, one afternoon, as he sat with a group of villagers, learning about their ways of life and the challenges they faced, James had a moment of clarity. This was why he had come. This was the purpose he had been searching for all along. The work he was doing, the people he was helping, It was more than just a project. It was a calling. As the sun set over the village, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, James felt a deep sense of peace. He had taken a leap of faith, and now he was here, making an impact in ways he never thought possible. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, James felt ready for whatever came next. He had embarked on this journey to change the world, but little did he know, the world was already changing him. The days in Nairobi passed quickly, each one bringing new challenges, experiences, and moments of growth. James had thrown himself wholeheartedly into the work, and the satisfaction of seeing tangible results was unmatched. He helped lay the foundation for new buildings, taught classes on sustainable farming, and even found himself in conversations that challenged his thinking, expanding his view of the world. But it wasn't just the work that was transforming him. It was the people. The villagers, with their resilience and warmth, had welcomed him as one of their own. They shared their stories with him, their struggles and triumphs, their dreams for the future. And in return, James found himself learning more about himself than he had ever expected. One particular afternoon, as he sat with a group of women who were teaching him how to plant maize in the red soil of the region, one of the women, Mama Amina, caught his eye. "You have changed since you arrived," she said with a smile, her hands deftly working the soil as she spoke. "You were unsure at first, but now I see you helping in ways that are not just with your hands. You help with your heart." James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him at her words. It was true. At first, he had been uncertain about his place in this foreign land, unsure if his efforts would truly make a difference. But now, it felt different. He felt connected to the people, to the land, and to the work they were all doing together. "You all have taught me so much," James replied. "I came here thinking I was the one doing the teaching, but you've shown me what real strength looks like. It's not in the work we do, but in the way we support each other." Mama Amina nodded thoughtfully, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "Strength is in community," she said softly. "It is in the way we lift each other up when times are hard, and how we celebrate each other's successes, no matter how small they may seem." As the weeks went by, James grew more involved with the community. He helped organize clean water initiatives, provided basic health education, and began working closely with local leaders to create lasting change. But the most rewarding part of his work came when he saw the direct impact of his efforts. A school that had once been in disrepair was slowly becoming a place of hope for the village's children. A garden that had once been barren was now producing food that nourished families who had once struggled to feed themselves. The seeds of change were being planted, both literally and figuratively. One evening, as he sat outside the small home where he was staying, James reflected on everything he had experienced since arriving. The bustling city, the quiet village, the people, the culture. Everything was a contrast to the life he had left behind. And yet, he had never felt more at peace. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the connections he had made, the lives he had touched, and the sense of purpose he had finally found. He picked up his phone, dialing Curtis's number. It had become a habit, these weekly calls, but tonight, James felt a particular urge to share his thoughts. "Hey, Curtis," he said when his friend picked up. "I just wanted to check in, let you know how things are going." Curtis's voice came through the phone, warm and familiar. "How's it all going over there? You sound different. I can hear it in your voice." James chuckled, leaning back against the stone wall behind him. "Yeah, I guess I am. I don't know how to explain it, but this place, these people, they've changed me. I feel connected, like I'm part of something bigger." Curtis was silent for a moment, probably processing what James had said. "Man, that sounds incredible. You went over there thinking you were going to change the world, but it sounds like the world's been changing you." James nodded, even though Curtis couldn't see him. "It's true. I thought I was just helping out, doing good work, but it's become so much more than that. It's about being part of something, being a part of these people's lives and watching them grow too. It's amazing what happens when you put yourself out there like that," Curtis said, his voice full of admiration. "I'm proud of you, man. You've found your purpose." The conversation continued late into the evening, as James shared his experiences and Curtis listened with the same enthusiasm he always had. But there was something different in James's voice, a depth, a calm certainty that hadn't been there before. He had found what he was meant to do, and it was in helping others. It was in building bridges, both between people and cultures, and within himself. As the call ended, James sat in the quiet of the evening, staring at the stars above him. He had come to Nairobi thinking he would be the one making an impact, but in truth, it was the people here who had changed him. They had shown him the true meaning of resilience, community, and love. And now, as he looked at the horizon, he knew there was still so much more to do. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, James felt confident that he was exactly where he needed to be. The world had opened up to him in ways he had never expected, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. As the sun set over the sprawling horizon, casting a warm, golden hue over the landscape, James stood at the edge of the village, watching the children play. The sound of their laughter was a balm to his soul, and for a moment, he allowed himself to be enveloped by the peace that seemed to radiate from this land. It had been nearly a year since he had first arrived in Nairobi, uncertain and filled with doubt. But now, as he looked at the thriving school and the community he had helped to build, he knew that the seeds of change had been planted, and they were growing. One of the village elders, a man named Kofi, approached him with a solemn expression. He had become a close friend and mentor to James during his time here, and his presence always carried a sense of wisdom and respect. "You have done much for us, James," Kofi said, his deep voice filled with gratitude. "More than you may ever know." James smiled, his heart swelling with appreciation. "I didn't do it alone. We all worked together. I've learned so much from all of you." Kofi nodded, his eyes scanning the village as if taking in the transformation. "You have given us hope, and for that, we will be forever grateful. But there is something I need to tell you, something important." James's curiosity was piqued. "What is it?" Kofi paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "We have decided to name the school after you. It will be called the James Thompson School of Hope, not just because of the work you've done, but because of who you are. You've inspired all of us, shown us the power of kindness, of perseverance, and most of all, of love." James was stunned. He hadn't expected anything like this. The idea of a school being named after him was humbling beyond words. I don't know what to say," James stammered, feeling a lump form in his throat. "This is more than I could ever have imagined." Kofi smiled gently, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Sometimes, when we give of ourselves, we receive in ways we never expected. This is your legacy, James. You have touched this community in ways that will last for generations." As the elder walked away, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about the physical work, building classrooms, planting crops, or providing clean water. It was about the lives he had touched, the connections he had made, and the love he had received from a community that had once felt so foreign to him. That evening, a celebration was held in his honor. The village gathered together, with families and children from every corner of the community coming to share in the joy of what had been accomplished. Music filled the air, and the rhythmic beats of the drums seemed to carry a sense of unity and gratitude. As James sat with Mama Amina and Kofi, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the man who had arrived in Nairobi so many months ago. Uncertain, unsure of his place in the world. That man had been searching for something, but he had never imagined that it would be this. It was more than just the work. It was the community, the love, the shared vision for a better future. And it was the knowledge that, together, they had created something that would outlast them all, a legacy that would continue to grow and inspire. Later that evening, James stood alone in front of the school, the glow of the lanterns casting long shadows across the field. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, knowing that he had done the right thing. His heart was full, his spirit at rest. And then, as if to confirm everything he had been feeling, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Curtis. "Just wanted to say, man, I'm proud of you. I always knew you were capable of greatness, but you've surpassed even my expectations. You've found your calling. Keep making that difference. I'm with you all the way." James smiled as he read the message, feeling a rush of gratitude for the friend who had supported him from afar. But it wasn't just Curtis who had been there for him. It was everyone in the village, and the countless others who had crossed his path during this journey. This was his family now. This was his home. And as he looked out at the village, the stars above shimmering in the night sky, James Thompson knew that he had not only found a new purpose, he had found a new life. A life filled with meaning, with love, and with the kind of hope that could change the world, one person at a time.